The problem that we're experiencing in the modern world now is we exist within these stories that are just constantly and aggressively repeated. And so we're always being conditioned to think these are the only options. And that's why when you talk to people nowadays, people are so pessimistic about the future. This is this real paradox to me because we exist in a moment right now where more is possible than has ever been possible. And if you look back over the course of human history, you start to realize all the extraordinary things that people have done with far less resources than we have right now. Yet when you talk to people, the mood is one of extraordinary pessimism.
Yeah.
And that's because we as a culture are losing the ability to imagine new stories.
Well, hello and welcome to the evening's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Moira Gunn, host of Tech Nation and its regular segment Biotech Nation, which we produce out of KQED for NPR affiliates nationwide and beyond. And I'm a professor and the director of bioentrepreneurship at USF, the University of San Francisco. And tonight I'll be talking with Angus Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher is the author of the new book, Primal Intelligence. You are smarter than you know. So now let me tell you a little about our speaker. Angus Fletcher is a professor of story science at Ohio State's Project Narrative. His research has been called life-changing by Brené Brown and mind-blowing by Malcolm Gladwell, both in a good way. I just wanted to say that. He's been endorsed by psychologists, neuroscientists, and doctors such as Martin Seligman and Antonio Damasio, and has been supported by institutions from the National Science Foundation to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. You may also know him from his earlier books, including Wonderworks, the 25 most powerful inventions in the history of literature. In 2023, he was awarded the Commendation Medal by the U.S. Army for his groundbreaking research with U.S. Army Special Operations into primal intelligence. And that's the subject of his new book, Primal Intelligence, You Are Smarter Than You Know. So, Angus, a great big hearty Commonwealth Club welcome to you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Maura. Thank you all for joining me this evening.
Now, Angus, I am all over your commendation medal from the U.S. Army Special Ops. I mean, we're talking Night Stalkers, talking PSYOPs, the psychological operations, home of the Army Rangers, of the Special Forces, the Green Beret. Did they give you a beret? What color?
I did not
Tan,
get a beret.
green?
I did not get a
How
beret.
about a uniform?
I did not know you knew so much about special operations. Normally, by the way, the first thing that people ask me is like, what is special operations? Can you explain it? I have to go through all the acronyms.
We like to date those guys. Whether we're married or not, this is interesting. That you're talking about running in the dismal swamp, whatever that is, running to an explosion, but you shouldn't be doing that. Now, they must have given you some camo.
They did not, actually. No, I was literally dressed like this. Yeah, I was wearing my sort of Saturday afternoon lesbian wear, as my friends like to refer to it as, my sambas and my polo shirt. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, it's probably secret, but you can tell us, what kind of groundbreaking research did you do for the Army?
So basically, the Army calls me because for a long time I'm considered to be a maverick. And the thing that I was particularly interested in is the fact that the human brain can do things that computers can't. And the question is, how? How is that happening? And there are two kind of broad answers to this question that are popular. The first is, we're going to figure out a way to get computers to do it somehow. Maybe we're going to give them more data. Maybe we're going to tune the algorithms, right? But that's the thing, right? Maybe somehow we can get computers to do it. And then the other answer is usually magic. There's like this mysterious soul or consciousness, and maybe when computers become conscious, they'll be able to do it. And, the point of my research is no, when you understand the mechanics of the human brain, when you understand how neurons work, you start to see that humans are capable of these low information processes like intuition, like imagination, like common sense. And so I've been writing all this work, but it was almost entirely theoretical. And then one day I got this call from Army Special Operations, and they said, "Hey, Dr. Fletcher, we've been watching you." And I said, "Oh, that's a little frightening." And I should also say that I'm a naturalized citizen. So when I hear that the U.S. Army has been watching me, my first thought is not, necessarily a positive one.
Right.
So I was a little nervous.
And where are you from originally?
I'm originally from England, so I don't know if we have. I'm actually from a part of the north of England that likes to consider itself Scotland. It's Cumbria. It doesn't actually believe that it's English. It still believes it's part of the Scottish Empire. But so that's where I come from. So not anywhere too different, but different enough. And so I get this phone call from the Army, and they're like, Professor Fletcher, we've been following you, and we've been noticing your research, and we've been noticing that a lot of people seem very interested in your research, but seem to have no idea what to do with it. It's so different. And I said, yeah, that's true. And they said, well, that's usually an indication that you're either a crank, like you're totally nuts, or there's potentially something groundbreaking here. And I said, oh, interesting. I didn't know the Army tracked this. I was like, yeah, we track this. We have a group of people whose job it is to see the future. And we think you could be the future. So basically, they brought me in. And the main reason they brought me in is not just because a lot of what I was saying about the human brain squared with what they had seen, but also because they had experienced this problem, which is that young people that they were bringing into the special operations pipeline were experiencing more anger, more anxiety, less ability to deal with real-world problems. One of the guys told me that they can solve math problems. Young kids today can solve math problems, but they can't solve life problems. Failure of initiative, so they kind of sit around and wait to be told what to do all the time, always looking for validation. So you teach college students, you've seen this, right?
Oh, yeah. We give a lot of participation medals out.
Yes, well, yeah, And
they're used to it.
And there's this failure to launch problem that college students have, and because you teach a lot of entrepreneurial subjects, and students today, a lot of the times they want to be entrepreneurs, but they lack the initiative and they lack the emotional confidence. And so they'll get to the end of college and they'll panic immediately and they'll just want to go into somebody else's workforce,
Right.
Or they'll suddenly think that their parents have suddenly become a lot smarter because whatever their parents are telling them to do, like go to law school, go to med school, suddenly seems so much better. And so we're sort of raising this generation of kids that lacks the ability to imagine futures for themselves, that lacks the ability to initiate change, and a lot of it comes from the school system. So anyway, so the Army said, we've seen this happening, and we want to bring you in, Professor Fletcher, to see if your theories can help reverse that trend, and we're willing to build training pipelines and invest millions and millions of dollars of funding in testing your zany theories.
Wow. How do you test them? You say, okay, give me 50 guys.
Yeah, basically.
Girls,
yeah. Well, if you want, I can tell you, the initial way that the Army wanted me to test the theories was, they come to my house, they basically kidnap me, they drive me for hours and hours and hours to this undisclosed location where I walk into this building, which is unlike any other building that I've ever seen in my life. It's sort of a mix of an NFL player's gym. It has sort of this incredibly high-tech equipment and people plugged into, respirators and oxygen masks, this kind of stuff, and they walk me through up to this classroom. And sitting in this classroom, there are all these individuals in their kind of late 20s and early 30s, and these are the kind of the future special operators. And just to kind of set the stage, I should say that about half of them are women, so they're selected for their ability to think differently. Essentially, they're not, you might have a kind of a picture in your mind of a special operator with like an enormous beard and kind of 6'6".
And a special operator is anybody in special ops.
That's right. A special operator is anybody in special ops. So anyway, I got into this classroom, right, and I'm looking at all these students, and the person in charge points to me and he goes, "Professor," and I'm like, "Yeah," and he's like, "Professor," he's like, "These operators are the smartest people that we could find. They live in the future. They're brilliant." I was like, "Oh, that's great." And then he goes, "Class, this professor is the smartest professor we could find. He's going to make you smarter." And I was like, "Okay." And then he points to me and goes, "Make them smarter now." And that was literally my opening experience. That's right, And I was like, oh my goodness. And that level of intensity is literally all you ever get in special operations. It's all that all the time. They're like, "This has to work faster now." So I had a panic attack, as I think most people would have in that situation. First of all, because, I have all these theories, but have you ever met a professor who are useless in real life? I don't want to blow our cool here. No, it's not. I just mean me as a professor. Obviously, other professors totally.
There's the radio show.
That's right.
You got to understand.
That's right.
I've got 2 part-time jobs.
That's right. So you're not really, you're a part-time professor. Yeah, that's right. But all real professors who have spent all their time in schools, right? What do we know about the real world? So first of all, I had all these theories, but like, how do I apply them, right? So that was the first thing. And second of all, I know nothing about special operators. And one of the weird things about being in the special operations community is it's kind of a trust on, trust off switch. So if they don't trust you, you know nothing. But in the moment they trust you, you're inside everything.
Yeah.
And I went in without a security clearance. And so I literally just get thrown in.
You did this without a security clearance?
Without a security clearance.
I'm
Yeah.
telling
This is something I had to negotiate.
You were out there for them
Yes.
to bring
Yeah,
you.
right. That's exactly right. Yeah. Well, they were desperate on this front because there's only one me, right? Just like there's only one you, there's only one me. And so when they want you, right, they're willing to bend the rules. So anyway, I had a panic attack. And then thinking as quickly as I've ever thought in my life, I said, you know what? In order to improve your training and make you smarter, I need to know what you're doing now. I need to see all of your existing training because I thought that would buy me some time.
Yeah.
You know? And then they took me on a tour of the building and they showed me all of the training. And I can't tell you that much, but I can tell you two things which I think are interesting. The first thing is they walked me past this room which had like the biggest computer I've ever seen in my life inside it. And they were like, this is the original AI, basically. And they told me, which I didn't know, that the US Army was responsible for basically inventing the computer. They designed ENIAC in 1943 during World War II. And so they've had these computers in the basement for forever. And they also invented generative AI and all these kinds of things. And so they had fed this computer with, like the minds of all the smartest generals in history. And it was supposed to be the most brilliant thing in the world. And I said, wow, this is amazing. Is this how you train your students? Do you have them, challenge themselves against this AI? And they're like, no. Turns out actually the computer's pretty dumb. And the more that people train against it, the less intelligent they get. And I was like, oh, okay. So they closed that door. And then they said, here's the room where we really train people. And they opened the door and it was a library. And it was full of books. And there were a lot of sort of interesting books in there. I can't talk too much about them, but one thing I can say about them is a lot of them were near future science fiction. And so basically jumping 2 years into the future. And the idea was that you would read these stories and you would start to imagine, what would I do in these realistic scenarios that haven't actually happened yet? And so I started to realize, actually a lot of the work they're doing here is kind of literary, it's kind of story driven.
Right.
And so I was able to kind of tuck in and start sort of training them a little bit in that way.
Wow, pretty exciting. So he could have written a book about that experience, but no. He took that experience and made it relevant to all of us. In fact, the real breakthrough for me when I started reading this book is that in the past, you've always talked about stories in general, creating stories, who created them, how you might create them, all of these things, what they did to people listening to them and telling them. But then you write, the most important story is the story you think to yourself about yourself. Let's go there.
That's right. That's 100% right. Yeah. So the first thing is we're taught that stories are largely for communicating, but we actually know this isn't true. We know that story evolved in the brain long before language did. It evolved hundreds of millions of years ago. And the reason it evolved in the brain is to allow us to imagine stories of the future so we could change the world. Another word for a story is a plot, is a plan. So really story is the way that our brain plans and imagines alternate futures. And so a big part of what drives our intelligence is our ability to tell these new narratives of the future. But even though those are important, what's most important is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, because it turns out that's what drives our ability to have something called anti-fragility, and also our ability to change the world around us. And so what is anti-fragility? Anti-fragility is the ability to get wiser from grief, from shame, and from negative experiences, and to get smarter from failure. It's the ability, in other words, to grow. And if you have a certain story inside your brain that is a story you tell about yourself, you're able to take all these negative experiences and process them into good experiences. And so what does that primordial story look like? This is something I was fascinated by, and this is something I was able to see, and an interesting point of overlap is that the operators who have anti-fragility are telling themselves the same story as 4-year-olds. And so we were able to kind of align these stories and kind of figure out what they were. So the first thing I want to say is that everyone's story that they tells themselves is a little bit different. We're all unique. There's no hero's journey. There's no archetypal story. There's no universal stories. There's nothing like that. All of us have our own unique stories. But the kind of common characteristic of a story, a personal story that possesses anti-fragility, is an integrated past and a branching future. So it looks a little bit like a trident. So when you think back over your past, everything that's happened to you, you're able to connect it together into one single sense of why. Why is this happening? And that helps you derive your sense of purpose. But when you look out in the future, you're able to see all of these branching possibilities. And what that combination does is it gives you a sense of personal momentum, but also adaptability, also flexibility. So, we're often taught of the importance of things like, grit and perseverance and persistence. And those things are important, but it's also important to be able to change. The question is how do you change without losing yourself? How do you change so you're not just drifting? And the answer is if you have that integrated past, what it does is it works for you like water going down a mountain. The more that stream picks up momentum, the more that even when it encounters a rock, it's able to go back on its original course after going around that rock. And so that integrated past branching future allows you to hit obstacles and then return around it and go back to who you are. And so a big part of what we discovered in the book is that operators have this, 4-year-olds have this, but then most people lose it through school and through work because school starts to disaggregate your past and starts to narrow your future. So if you look at most people in business environments, they actually have a fractured past and a narrow future. Like they can only really see one path ahead for themselves. They get very tight. And they look back on their past and they think of themselves as being kind of multiple people, not exactly sure who they are. And that shape is the same shape as a soldier with post-traumatic stress disorder. Wow. And so a big part of what we were doing in the community was figuring out how to heal that in operators and then take that out and then heal that in people outside.
You referred to 4 primal powers, essential powers that humans have: intuition, imagination, emotion, and common sense. Intuition speaks plans. Imagination shapes plans. Emotion sustains plans. And common sense selects plans. Well, I think for starters, I think a lot of people tend to confuse intuition and imagination. What's the difference?
Yeah, so intuition is your ability to spot opportunities. And one of the first things I started to do with the operators is start to identify not just what intuition is, but how you can get better at it. And what we started with is a common misunderstanding about intuition. So if you ask most psychologists today what intuition is, they'll tell you that it's pattern matching. And this comes from someone called Daniel Kahneman, who's a famous, recently deceased psychologist, and it also comes from computer science. And so the idea is that when you have a sudden insight, it's because you're matching a pattern. This is the idea. Well, we know this has to be wrong.
Boring.
It is boring. It is boring. And we also know that it has to be wrong because, first of all, computers are incredible at pattern matching. But have you ever met a computer with intuition? Right? Have you ever met a computer that was able to identify a possibility that someone hadn't seen before? No, computers can't do that. That's a missing skill. And we also know that with children, it turns out children have incredibly high levels of intuition, but they're actually pretty bad at pattern matching. And there's a whole bunch of studies that have confirmed this. So what's actually going on? Well, it turns out what's going on is that when you have an intuition, you're not spotting a pattern, you're spotting an exception. So you're actually doing the opposite of spotting a pattern. You're spotting something that doesn't fit. And when you spot something that doesn't fit, what your brain is saying is, whoa, if this is happening and it doesn't fit the pattern, then there are possibilities beyond the pattern. So the way that we think about the world doesn't actually tell us everything that's possible in the world. And what happens when we start to lean into that exception and imagine all the different possibilities that might unfold from it. So intuition is that ability to spot those opportunities and spot those exceptions and realize that the past does not determine the future and that there are all these opportunities in the future that are hinted to us by these emergent shifts in the present. And then what imagination does is it takes those opportunities and turns them into plans. So if you've ever met somebody whose mind seems that they're running like 1,000,000 miles a minute and they're just seeing all these different ways in which I could go this way, I could go that way, I could go the other way, that's imagination. And so that's why highly creative people are always able to imagine all these different ways that things can happen. And I'll be honest, people often think that I'm a highly creative person because they look at my career and they read this book. I'm actually a pretty low imagination and I have even lower intuition. It's just because I spend all my time around people with high intuition, high imagination that I seem to have them. And so those are those two powers. But it turns out the keys, really, once you've got those going, are the emotion and the common sense. Because what the common sense does is it allows you to pick the plan that's going to work. So famously, people are highly creative. They're able to come up with lots of different plans. And then they always pick the plan that they find most interesting, right? They say, you know what? I'm a creative person. I'm going to pick the most creative plan. And most of the time that doesn't work, right? Because most of the time the plan that works is more boring. So common sense is the ability to say, hey, would a creative plan work here or not? And if not, what's a less creative plan that I could execute instead? So intuition, imagination, and common sense are helping you create plans, new plans that can work. But what emotion is doing is it's saying, what plans could work for me? What are the plans that would not only succeed, but fit with my own life narrative? So that as I go through life, I'm not just successful, but I feel personally fulfilled. And those are the kind of 4 things that we identified. But then I think hopefully the thing, if you read the book and you like it, hopefully the thing you'll find most interesting is this book isn't just about identifying these powers. It's about saying, here's how you can get better at them. Here's how you train them up. Here are these exercises that we developed in the special operations community behind the veil, and then we took out of the special operations community and we put it in the conventional army, and they continued to work because there's this prejudice in the army that special operators are special. And of course it works for the special operators, but it's not going to work for all these people in the conventional army, right? But no, of course it works, right? It works because it turns out that everybody has intuition and everybody has imagination, and everybody has common sense. You just got to train it up. And then once we did it there, we took it into schools. And we did it with elementary students and college students and all these other kinds of students. And we got a lot of great success there, and I published a bunch of stuff on that. But we didn't really get the breakthrough in the educational space until we went into businesses. Because it turns out that students and parents don't trust you until something has worked in business. They're like, well, sure, it works in school, right? But is it going to work, right, when I'm at Google or whatever, right? And so we went into all these companies where, like, it actually does work there, And then the educational spaces were like, okay.
Because they're all full of humans.
That's right, exactly, because a human is a human, right?
Whether you're in school or in business. It'll work.
That's right.
Now, under common sense, you write about anxiety. And generally, we think of anxiety as bad, but it's also good. You say, tune your anxiety by ridding the future of the past. Let's talk about tuning anxiety.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because anxiety is good, and we're taught to fear it in the modern world. So let me give a little bit of a caveat about this. So this is a common sense chapter, and my common sense is actually negative. If you read the book, you'll see all sorts of instances in which I do exactly the opposite of what a smart person should do in a situation. So I really had to be bootstrapped up in terms of my common sense. And having started from being really, really negative, my common sense is probably close to 0 now. So that gives you a sense of how much I've improved.
Accomplishment.
That's right. It's right. You too can be almost at 0 if you were at negative. But this meant that I had to walk through the steps really slowly with the operators, because the operators had to really train me on everything. And it turned out that the breakthrough came when we realized that for the operators, training your common sense actually comes from learning your anxiety and what your anxiety is telling you. So anxiety evolved in the human brain to help you determine the volatility of your environment. So if you're anxious and you're appropriately anxious, that's telling you there's something to be worried about because you're in a new situation. So anxiety evolved to help you determine environmental novelty, or to be technical about it, the number of unknown unknowns. So if your anxiety is working appropriately, it'll start to go up when you're in a situation where there's a lot of unknown factors. So a lot of people talk, for example, about how they have social anxiety. This is a very common thing. But that's actually totally normal, because what's more unknown than other people you haven't met before? I mean, they could actually do anything. When you walk into a room full of strangers, that's a reason to be anxious, because who knows, right?
Right.
Who knows? There's all these different. So what you have to do is, once you start to realize, okay, anxiety is good, anxiety is smart, but anxiety is malfunctioning in the modern world. And a lot of us are anxious all the time for reasons that we shouldn't be anxious, and we're not getting the benefits of anxiety. So how do we kind of get those benefits? And so to your point, there are these 2 simple steps that the operators take. The first thing is they distinguish future anxiety from past anxiety. So it turns out a lot of things you're worried about happening in the future are things that have already occurred to you, and you're worried they're going to happen again. But here's the thing. If they've already occurred to you, then you know how to deal with them. So make a plan to deal with them and then let them go. Don't worry about them happening again, because if they happen again, you're prepared. So that's the first thing that operators do. And then the second thing they do is they focus on what they call the now plus 1. So the way this works is, when you're looking into the future, the further you look into the future, by definition, the more unknowns there are. There's more unknowns a year from now than there are a month from now. There's even more unknowns 5 years from now. And what a lot of people do when they have uncontrollable anxiety is they just start looking too far into the future. And the more they look into the future, the more they start to panic because they realize there's all these unknowns there. And then they say, you know what? My anxiety is bad, I've got to ignore it, right? And then they just try and focus on presentness, right? Or meditation or Zen or something like that. But then you're missing out the benefit of your anxiety. And so really what you want to do is you want to push your anxiety one moment forward in time. So you're looking just a little bit into the future, into what you can most immediately control. And when you do that, what you'll start to feel is that you have like a light anxiety, because there's a little bit of unknown there, but that anxiety is actually energizing you. And it's helping you detect possibilities. And the more you focus on that, the more you'll enter into the state that's called flow. So you've probably heard of flow before, but you get flow when you are engaged in an activity that's occupying basically your whole brain in a kind of positive way, and your anxiety is waking up all these dormant portions of your brain, so you engage all of them in this near-term activity rather than looking so far ahead that you panic or being so present that you're disengaged.
Well, you take these powers and you apply them in various situations, various contexts. And here's one insight which I think is telling. You say the best decisions match the newness of your plan to the newness of your situation. Then you write, going where experts can't say no. Well, explain that, Dr. Fletcher.
All right, so I'll explain this in two parts. And again, this is the common sense part. And I like that you're grilling me on common sense because I have no common sense. So
I found his weak spot.
That's right. No, you definitely. So the first thing about common sense is you want to match your plan to the environment. You want to pick the right plan for the times. And what that means is that in really new times, you have to pick a really new plan. Whereas in familiar times, you just go with something that kind of worked yesterday because the times are pretty much the same. Now, this seems obvious, but it turns out most of us don't do this. What happens most of the time is that we're in a familiar situation, we get bored, and we take a risk. So how many times in your life have you taken your greatest risks when you're bored? That's not commonsensical. And the flip side of that is that most of us, when we get in really volatile environments, get nervous and retreat to something that worked in the past. We're like, oh my goodness, I feel so uncertain. I want to go back, I want to do what was working yesterday or 10 years ago or whatever. That's the way to fix the problem. And actually, no, because even though the future is unknown, so we don't know exactly what's going to work, we know that old plans by definition are definitely not going to work. So you have a much higher chance of succeeding by using a new plan, even if you don't know what the likelihood of success is, than an old plan, because the old plan, the chance of working is zero. So you've got to get yourself in this psychology where in new times, I'm going to do new things. Even though I don't know they're going to work, I know that they can work, whereas I know that old plans cannot work. So this is where we get into experts and how experts can be useful.
Where experts
can't say no. Because a lot of us have a bad relationship to expertise. Like when we're sort of lost in our lives, we'll go to a mentor, and then we'll ask them, what should I do? And the reality is what the mentor tells you to do will work yesterday. Because the mentor is coming from the past, and they're telling you what worked for them. So then we say, well, then mentors must be useless. If they only knew what worked yesterday, right, then I'm going to ignore them and just go on my own. No, that's not right. Mentors are really good at telling you when something has been tried and failed, and they can explain to you why it failed. And so when you go where experts can't say no, what you're doing is you're giving a plan to an expert. You're saying, has this been tried before? Can you prove to me that it can't work? If they can prove to you it can't work, don't do it. But if they're like, well, it seems really risky, but I can't tell you that it won't work, go for it. Because what the expert is telling you is that your plan goes beyond the limits of expertise, which means that it's genuinely new. And the only plans that can work in genuinely new environments are genuinely new plans, which means a plan that an expert has not seen before and therefore can't say no.
Now, some people would say, well, I'm just of an age where I just, nothing new. A lot of people take, for instance, retirement, and they go, okay, I'm going to shut down, do nothing. And then other people say, well, hey, we just started having kids, we bought this house, or we want to buy a house. All this stuff is going on, so I'm not even going to have a plan. But you say something, one of your challenges, which I particularly liked, was what possible victories can you achieve this year?
Yeah.
Let's talk about what a victory is and how you might choose to do that and why that might be good for you.
Yeah, well, because ultimately, why is it good for you to have a victory? Well, because the purpose of life is growth. That is the purpose of life. And we know that instinctively, and if you go out in nature, that's all that nature is doing, is nature is growing. But you're right, we as human beings, at a certain point, we're like, I just want everything to stay the same. I just want to be comfortable, right? But growth is what both gives you the deepest joy in life, and it's also what protects your future. And, if you're a parent, you have to model growth for your kids. If you're a teacher, you've got to take risks in the classroom and model growth for your students. And so what that means is you've got to identify for you what a victory would be, what's something that you want to succeed at, and then figure out ways that that victory becomes possible. Not probable, but possible. Do you want me to talk about the difference between possibility and probability, or is that something?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So this is something I found totally fascinating. I don't know if you guys will find this fascinating because you're maybe not quite as weird and nerdy as me. But there's a difference in your brain between possibility and probability. So if you're thinking about probability, that goes on in a totally different part of your brain than when you're thinking about possibility. And what's interesting about that is if you ask most people today to explain the difference between possibility and probability, they'll probably tell you, well, a possibility is a kind of low probability. So, a possibility is probably like maybe 10% or maybe 5% or 1% or something like that. And the reality is no, it's totally different. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that probability is calculated off of things that have happened in the past. So you can go through all those events that have happened in the past, you can correlate them with other factors, and you can compute the likelihood that they'll happen again. This is what computers do. They think in probability. A possibility is something that has never happened before, but could happen because it doesn't break the laws of your environment. The classic example of this is end of the 19th century, world's greatest statistician. His name is Lord Kelvin. He's the president of the Royal Society. He's so good at math that he's basically the first computer just by himself. And he sits down and he proves mathematically that there will never be an airplane. Why? Well, because there'd never been an airplane before. So the probability of there being an airplane was zero. And you can go and you can read this. He actually says this in 1895. He comes out definitively. And then they came back to him in 1902 and they said, are you still sure about this? He's like, absolutely. Look at the math. The math proves it. And then what happened a year later, of course, the Wright brothers, they flew. And why is it the Wright brothers were able to fly? Because they were thinking in possibility. And one of the reasons they were thinking impossibility was that they were reading these imaginative stories that were on their father's bookshelf. And so when you think about your own future, what's important is to start to think in possibility, to start to imagine all the different stories that your life could take, and to realize that the power of story in the human brain is not to identify a single true narrative. This is why people are suspicious of stories nowadays, is they'll say, well, you know what? When people start thinking in narrative, then they just take all the data and they use it to fit their narrative, right? You'll hear this all the time, particularly from a certain kind of mathematician or economist that doesn't like story. They'll talk about stories are just forms of bias, is what they'll say. Well, only if you're misusing story. Because if you're using story appropriately, you don't have a single story in your brain that you think is the most probable story. You instead have multiplying stories, all that are possible. And so when you're thinking about how you can win in the future, what you're doing there is you're thinking, what are all the different ways that I can achieve my goals? What are all the different paths that I can take? And this makes people nowadays nervous when they start thinking about that, because people nowadays, we've been conditioned by our school system and by the way that business works and by the way that computers and math works to think, no, there's got to be a right answer. It's got to be efficient. I know it's got to work. But when you look at children, children are energized by thinking of possibilities. Children love the idea that there are all these different options, you know? And if you can get your own brain back into that state of just thinking, what are some different ways that I could win this year?
Yeah.
Then when you start to do that, you start to unlock this ability of your brain to imagine these futures. And what you'll find is that the victory you achieve is probably not one of the ones you imagined, but it's remarkable in its own way.
Now, you document in detail the impact of William Shakespeare on many famous people of all sorts ever since Shakespeare existed. And you talk about American actor Charlotte Cushman as grasping Shakespeare's core insight. What makes a story work isn't its fidelity to formulas, it's how it breaks the rules. Right. What happens in our brains when it hears, sees, experiences, if whatever, a story that breaks the rules?
When we experience a story that breaks the rules, we suddenly feel liberated because we realize that we ourselves can break the rules. And one of the reasons I feel this is important to say is because we live in a world now which is obsessed with narrative formulas. So if you go on the internet, you'll see whether it's the hero's journey, the Joseph Campbell hero's journey, whether it's the 8 classic types of story, fish out of water, so on and so forth. There's all these formulas out there. And these all defy the biological reality, which is that story exists in the brain to imagine things that haven't happened before. There's no formula for story. And we're reminded of that when we see a story that breaks the rules. And this is actually really the primordial function of a writer like Shakespeare, but also of just, hanging out and sharing stories with each other. I mean, when you hang out with your friends and they start telling you these stories, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, wait, did this really actually happen? I can't imagine. And you're like, no, this actually happened. You're not only starting to develop a sense of why you're close to your friend, because your friend is unique, and you start to realize, oh, I really like this person because they're special, not because they're a formula, not because they're the archetypal friend,
Yeah.
But you're also starting to develop this sense of wonder where you're like, oh my goodness, life can go in all these ways that I didn't imagine before. And it's putting you back in contact with those primordial stories. And the problem that we're experiencing in the modern world now is we exist within these stories that are just constantly and aggressively repeated. So if you go on media, it's always the same stories over and over and over again. Hollywood is endless, and I can say this because I've worked a lot in Hollywood. Hollywood is always repeating the same stories over and over and over and over and over again. And so we're always being conditioned to think these are the only options. And that's why when you talk to people nowadays, people are so pessimistic about the future. This is this real paradox to me because we exist in a moment right now where more is possible than has ever been possible. We have so many extraordinary resources in terms of our human resources, in terms of technology, in terms of science, in terms of art. More is possible now than has ever been possible. And if you look back over the course of human history, you start to realize all the extraordinary things that people have done with far less resources than we have right now. Yet when you talk to people, the mood is one of extraordinary pessimism.
Yeah.
And that's because we as a culture are losing the ability to imagine new stories. We can't look into the future and imagine different ways that it could go. Instead, we're just caught recycling the same formulas. And this is, of course, reinforced in school by this idea that it's all archetypes and so on and so forth. And so what's wonderful about Charlotte Cushman, and you probably haven't heard of her, but she was the greatest actor in the 19th century. And she became legendary because she wanted to act in a performance of Romeo and Juliet. And when she went to the stage had rewritten Romeo and Juliet to make it have a happy ending, in which Romeo and Juliet got married. Now, I don't want to spoil the play for any of you who haven't seen it, but it's not called The Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet because Romeo and Juliet get married at the end. And so she got to the Playhouse and she was like, what's going on with this, And the guy at the Playhouse who was running the Playhouse, it was the most successful playhouse in London at the time, he was like, we've discovered that audiences just like the same stories over and over and over again. They like these formulaic romantic comedies. And, all this stuff that Shakespeare did, just between the two of us, it's really weird. Like his stories, they're just so odd and his characters are so eccentric. This guy Hamlet, he talks forever. Like, what are you talking about? Just kill the king and get the play over with. It's all really weird, And so, we just decided we would rewrite all of Shakespeare. And this happened. If you go back to the 18th, 19th century, they rewrote all of Shakespeare to make it into these romantic comedies. And Charlotte, she
King
was...
Lear. What?
Yeah, I know. That actually becomes a romantic comedy. King Lear, can you imagine? It's like the bleakest play in history. And I'm like, we should make a romantic comedy out of it. People will like that better. So anyway, Charlotte comes along, and she's like, I'm going to act the original Shakespeare play. I'm going to do it the way that it was performed. And the theater basically tried to break her contract. They tried to throw her out. They're like, people won't like it. It's too weird. It's too new. But finally, she got her way. And then as she was walking on stage, she said, and by the way, one other thing, I'm going to play Romeo. And so she went on the stage and played Romeo. And audiences loved it. It was the most popular play of the season, was her playing Romeo in Shakespeare's original play. And what that is a reminder of is that audiences want new stories. Producers are afraid to give it to them. And, I tell you, I've worked all this time in Hollywood. Producers get terrified because they want to make a story that they know is going to make money, and to them, that's the story that was successful last season. It's the same thing if you write books. You've got to have a really courageous editor, like my editor was pretty courageous to publish this book, to do something totally new. Because editors really, at their heart, they just don't want to be embarrassed. And so they have this natural tendency to get conservative, to get tight at the last moment, and go with what worked before. Go with the blueprint. Go with the existing stereotype. But really, what audiences love, and I know you know this in your gut, because all of you have had an experience of walking in to see a movie that changed you because it defeated your expectations. It was not what you thought was going to happen. And that was what was transformative about it. That was what was exciting to you about it, was the fact that it told you a story you hadn't been expecting before. And so what we need to do is we need to start to create a culture in which students, young people, can start to develop more of these stories instead of being forced to think in formula, and which we ourselves support more of these stories and put more of them out and get over our anxiety and our fear that somehow they're not going to be successful because people don't like new things.
And to your point earlier, it's like, what am I going to do with my life at 17, 21? It's like, yeah, you can do some things that are different or do things that are apparently the same, but you're taking a twist on
That's
them.
right. That's right.
And that's really, really important. I'm also reminded of, I love humor and I love the brain. And, in these unexpected stories or unexpected takes on things, it's almost like there's a little lightning switch in your brain that jumped from one neuron to the other that never was there before. Right. And you're laughing.
Right.
And you're excited. There's energy that happens in your brain.
That's right. Yeah. And so what's happening there is two things, right? So first of all, we've already talked about how when you have that sense of possibility, you discover possibility in the world. But what you've just pointed out is your brain discovers a possibility in itself. It realizes I can make that connection. It realizes that these neurons can come together. It realizes that I have the capacity to see stories and experience stories and enjoy stories and laugh at things that I never thought I could do before. And that it gives you that primordial sense of growth again. I mean, that's what's so exciting. All of us have had that sort of like epiphanic moment where, whether it's we're watching a movie or we're watching a comedy and we laugh, or we're in a class and we have a particularly inspired professor who's teaching us something, or we're like, whoa, I never would have thought that those two things would fit together. But they do. That makes us more confident in ourselves because it realizes that we have this power, this perception that allows us to see things that we hadn't seen before, and it's growing.
Now, the reason that Angus could tell us he went from negative to zero on common sense, and we applaud him for that, is that he has a quiz. It's in the book. You can take it, the Primal Self-Assessment Quiz. And we're all trying to maximize all four capabilities. Remember, intuition, imagination, emotion, and common sense. And you can see where you are. And of course, I took it. So, how'd you think I scored? Who are my top two?
I imagine you have very high imagination. Am I right on that? Mm-hmm. And you seem like you have a lot of so I would either guess intuition or emotion.
Intuition and imagination.
Intuition and imagination.
But
yeah.
The funny thing is about going to emotion, when you have these things and you say, I really want to do it, the emotion and the common sense tells you, like, well, this is how you should go about it, or maybe not. That's such a good idea. But in these times when things get tough, the emotion has to carry you through. You can't go back to the logic and say, well, what are the probabilities?
Exactly.
I'm going to overcome this. Exactly. It's like that emotion has to carry you on that project.
Yes, it does. Yeah, well, so, here's the basic thing that you've all experienced is that if you think something is right, you generally don't do it, right? You think that it's right, but if you feel that something is right, you do it. And at a certain point, you have to feel like your own story is right. You have to feel that. So I'm not surprised you have high intuition and imagination. And I also want to point out, as far as the quiz goes, if you take it from the book, these are relative scores. So these are scores relative to you. So your common sense could be your lowest score, but it could still be many times higher than mine.
It's negative. But you gave me hope, Angus. You
Yes.
gave me hope.
Yeah, I seem like I have some common sense, right? And one of the things we discovered in the book is that, or in writing the book, is that in young people particularly, they have the ability to have explosive growth in all of these. And we did tons and tons of work with kids as young as 8, where we showed that they could have dramatic improvement in their emotion scores or their common sense scores or their imagination scores. And the reason this is important is what we start seeing around 3rd grade is a huge decline in all of these. So, this isn't work that was done by my lab. This is work that's been done for more than 30 years. And what's shocking to me is that this work has been around for 30 years, no one has done anything about it, is we know that the longer that kids spend in school, the better they get at standardized tests, but the worse they get at knowing themselves, the worse they get at being able to imagine new plans. So one of the reasons we see this spike in anxiety and anger in young people today is because they don't have the ability, once they're challenged, to figure out a response that's healthy and appropriate. Instead, when they get challenged, they immediately go into a fight or flight response, and either attack or try and run away. And this is all correlated with them entering school. And so one of the things I hope, if you read the book and you're like me and you're bad at some of these skills, and in fact, I will say, as I reveal at the back of the book, that I'm actually pretty dreadful at all of the skills, or at least I was to start out with. And sometimes people read this book and they're like, oh, Angus, you must have so much primal intelligence, you must be so primal. I want to bring you into my company, and so you can, be so imaginative. And I'm like, actually, I'm like dire at all of these things. Like any product of the American school system, I have amazing standardized test scores, and I'm so good at logic puzzles, and I think like a computer, and I'm actually bad at all these things. But, we've seen in other people, and you can see a little bit in me. I'm probably not oozing common sense at the moment, but I am surviving up here on stage. I'm functioning.
But they convinced us both to come up here. It kind of tells you something.
And so the point of it is you can train this up in yourself. And also, if you see somebody around you who's struggling in some way, so much of success in life just comes down to your ability to initiate plans. And the reason that's important is not only because plans are what, drives success, but if you're initiating them, you're not becoming dependent on other people. The moment you start becoming dependent on other people, what's happening is you're, first of all, losing your own way. And so I work with a lot of people who are quite successful in their life, but they're successful because they've essentially taken their plans for success from other people, and they've had these moments of fear and stress in their life where they didn't know what to do, and rather than sort of figuring it out themselves, they just, they went to medical school, or they happened to get lucky and join a startup at the right time or whatever, And so they've kind of lost their own way. And so being able to initiate plans means, no, this is my plan. I'm not dependent. I'm not going to ask AI for what I should do. I'm not going to ask anyone outside. I'm going to do it myself. And that means that your success grows from within. And, you work with a lot of entrepreneurs. You see how this is,
Yeah.
Entrepreneurs have this ability to come up with something new, stick with it through failure, change it, but always continue that active process of not doing what other people are doing it their own way. And, this is the opportunity of democracy, right? This is the opportunity of a free world, is to do that. And so many of us have that opportunity and are not exercising it.
It's really interesting. I remember that there was one, I was working with an engineering company, and working with the president, and they were so happy with this president and this kind of thing. And every time somebody had a new idea, he'd go, oh yeah, we have to go research best practices. And I'm like, best practices are like the enemy of innovation. If everybody's doing it, it's not innovation anymore. And he didn't last too long.
Well, that's good that he didn't last too long, because there have been a lot of studies that have shown that actually most, quote, leaders of companies are actually followers. Because what do? They follow the data.
Yeah.
And do you need a leader to follow the data? No, you don't, right? The job of a leader is to take the first step into the unknown. And particularly if you're the leader of a company, or you're the leader of a group, the way you do that is not just by doing that yourself, but by empowering the people around you. And, by saying to them, you know what, I don't know if this is going to work, and I don't know if you're right, but I trust you to take that step. And I also trust you that if that step doesn't work, you're going to figure out the next step that will work. And that's something that is missing because we've become so conservative and fear averse. And we've developed this belief that somehow there's evidence out there for whether new things will work.
Now, I already have some questions, and we welcome more questions as well. And there's a little AI frisson in some of these. I'll combine them with mine. You were mentioning earlier about what AI could do and could not do, and even with all the tech that's been developed within that spectrum, you write that the questions most often posed to you by AI engineers and cognitive scientists is trying to simulate the mind. Now, how are our brains different from any program of AI, and how is that reflected in our primal powers?
So the key main difference between your brain and a computer is your brain can be smart with little information. I mean, that's basically it. Computers get smarter the more information you give them. If I give you a lot of information, you get immediately overwhelmed. What that's telling you is that your brain is running different mechanical processes. And that's why computers are useful, because they are different, not because they're the same as us. And there are manifold problems with AI. And, one of the sort of quirky things about my career is I've worked with AI and in AI for almost 10 years in terms of natural language processes, which are kind of the origin of LLMs and whatnot. So this is an area that I know quite a lot, and I've been a very hardcore skeptic on AI for a long time, and I've written a lot of stuff. And it's only recently that skepticism has started to become shared by people. Because I think what we're starting to see is a lot of people are seeing a lot of the problems in AI that I have pointed out. And of course, those problems are things like the lack of originality, the sort of superficiality of the AI. But also, more fundamentally, the more we ourselves rely on AI, the less we use the parts of our brain that are special. And so the real problem with AI has always been not just that AI is not perfect, because why would any machine be perfect? It's just a tool, and it's not the tool's fault that it's not perfect. But the more that we rely on it, the more we kind of lose these capacities in ourselves. And so a big part of the reason that I'm so skeptical on AI is because it's being sold to us now largely as something to depend on. And you just find that the more you depend on AI, the more you start to go down this slope where you lose your own natural intelligence.
Well, before there was Google, remember that? Before there was Google, for generation after generation back through the millennia, people told stories, especially older people who had memories of their youth, might not remember what happened this morning, but certainly remembered back then. And it connected us all, generation to generation stories, which we have in our own families. Will this be replaced by whatever AI scrapes up from the internet, or will families still be families and the family stories still remain?
So a big part of what the difference between those family stories and AI is the difference between wisdom and knowledge. AI has all this knowledge in it, has all this data in it. But wisdom is different from knowledge, and anyone who's lived probably more than 30 or 35 years just understands the difference automatically. But wisdom is something that helps you in unfamiliar situations. It kind of passes on these rules of thumb. It passes on these kinds of experiential lessons. It makes you feel like you've actually participated in your parents' lives. It helps you feel like you've participated in this whole history. And a big part of that participation is just this confidence in your ability to survive in the unknown. Whereas what knowledge is knowledge is telling you this is a known answer to a known situation. And so, whether or not AI will replace that, I think that humans are starting to get tired of technology. I think, we're sort of at this hand-wringing phase where people are like, oh my goodness, technology is so bad. It's just, and then I think at a certain point, people are like, I've had enough. And I think you're going to start to see more and more people pivot away from it. And I think that that's going to be healthy because I think technology is useful to some extent, right? All of us have had our lives improved in some way by technology. But the problem is the dependence. So I'm skeptical that knowledge will replace wisdom, but in a lot of individual pockets of individual lives, it is, and you just think about how many times in the past, would you maybe have called your parents to talk through something, or called through, someone else who was wise
Mom,
and
what's the
experienced.
cheese sauce recipe?
Right. Exactly. Right. Yeah.
Google,
And then at
yeah.
the same time, she's telling you the recipe. She's telling you all these other things, which in the moment she's telling you, I'm like, oh my goodness, what does that
Well, I always do this. Remember when I burned it,
But
you
then
know?
it turns out, right? Those are actually the most important parts,
Right,
and those are the
right.
things that contain like the real insights.
Now, I know you have children, and one of the things that has happened unbelievably throughout all the kids that are in school today, from age 6 up until through high school, is all of the screens, whether it's television and any television anytime, it's smartphones, it's games, they're everywhere, and they're insidious, and they're all of these kinds of things, and they're a real problem. Where do you come down on the screens with respect to the kids and just any of us, I guess, but compared to the fact that we're human,
Yeah, so the main problem with screens is that they introduce your brain into a frictionless environment. So the whole point of technology is to make things as easy as possible, to remove friction. And what that means is that the more you use the technology, the more you like it because it's easy. And then it also means the less able you are to interact with anything that isn't technology because anything that isn't technology includes friction. And the source of the biggest friction in our lives is what? Other people. So what happens is the more you use these devices, then you're like, oh, this device is great. It makes me feel so powerful. I mean, one of the things, people don't actually know this. I mean, part of the reason that Steve Jobs is such a genius, but also part of the reason that his legacy is somewhat fraught, is because the reason he invented the Macintosh the way that he did was to make you feel more powerful. The purpose of the Macintosh computer is to give you the experience of almost being a god. Because if you went back and you used the original IBMs, it was like, oh my goodness, this is so complicated. I feel so stupid all the time. I'm having to type commands and use these like prompt things. And then what does Jobs do with the Macintosh? He gives you the mouse, which he didn't invent, but he saw the point behind it. So now all of a sudden, I can just move things around.
And no manuals.
And no manuals, right? Exactly.
Hey.
So all of a sudden, you just feel powerful, and you get this enormous emotional reinforcement. And the whole point of UX and user design has been to create this emotional sense of it's so intuitive to me, the user, right? I don't even have to think about it, and that just makes you think that somehow reality should obey the same rules. And when it doesn't, you don't know how to deal with it. And you're like, oh my goodness, this is so irritating. There must be something wrong. All the time with my students, I have this, where they come into my office and they say to me, I'm like seeing this person, but I think that they're like a psychopath. And I'm like, you think they're a psychopath?
Really?
Like, why do you think they're a psychopath?
happen
It's like,
in biology.
yeah, that's right. Well, we were talking about this movie, and they don't like the movie that I like. And I was like, okay, and then what? No, that's it. They don't like the movie that I like. They must be a psychopath. And I'm like, what? And then you realize it's because they don't know how to deal with interpersonal friction. And the moment that there's any conflict, they're like, something must be wrong here. And what must be wrong here is either me, and I must be a failure and a loser, right? And I need to throw myself out of society, or the other person has the dark triad. Have you guys heard of this thing, the dark triad, where all my undergraduates are obsessed with this idea that people are going around carrying like narcissism and Machiavellianism and all these kind of traits that go together and make them evil. And so anytime they experience like a momentary sense of discomfort in a relationship, they think that something is catastrophically wrong, as opposed to being like, oh, this is a moment for growth. Because clearly we're both two interesting people who aren't understanding each other at the moment. So let's figure out how to tell stories to each other that allow us to kind of get our narrative together. And so that's, I think, the real problem with technology, is it's habituating our brains to think that somehow life should be effortless, when actually the hard parts, as we all know, are the best parts. I mean, the things that in your life that have given you the most strength and the most wisdom have been the most challenging parts. And so why are we trying to eliminate all of that? So, of course, we don't need friction all the time. There's times when it's nice just to have something be effortless. And so I'm not arguing that technology is terrible or bad, but the more we give people that at a young age, the more they start to think this is the way the world should be, the less it's helping them develop the capacity for growth.
Maybe these students could give each other participation ribbons for having... Never mind. That was a really bad one. Here's another good question. I'm integrating them all here. You talk about many of the visionaries, Steve Jobs and Nikola Tesla and all kinds of people. Is there a commonality in their primal intelligence, or are they all different? What do you see there?
Well, the one thing, as I talk about in the book, is that all of them read Shakespeare. And this I found totally fascinating. It's like, what is going, what is happening that all of them are reading Shakespeare? And it turns out that they're not just reading Shakespeare, they're reading Shakespeare in the same way. And they're all of them particularly obsessed with Hamlet. And there's this line in Hamlet, as a stranger, give it welcome. In other words, the weirder and odder something is, the more you should embrace it. And what you see with all of these thinkers is that when they see something unusual or different, they don't do what a computer would do. So what does a computer do when it sees something weird or unusual? Well, it skips over it, or it regresses it to the mean. That's what a computer does, is it skips over exceptions. But what all of these thinkers did is they doubled down on exceptions. Once they saw something weird or odd, they said,
that's interesting.
let's have more of it. Let's have more of it. And that's the same process that occurs in your brain when your brain is telling a story. Because what happens in a story? Well, first of all, a story starts out with an exception. That exception is the main character, the hero, the person who is different from everyone else in her world. That's why she's the main character. So what does she do? Does she regress herself to the mean? No, she doubles down on what's distinct or unique about herself. And by doing so, she changes the world around her. And so this way of thinking in story that is natural to us, but that all of these thinkers felt reinforced through Shakespeare, you go through, and as I walk through in the book, step by step by step, you can actually see how it was that it led Einstein to invent the theory of relativity, how it was that led Van Gogh to develop his theory of color, how it was that Nikola Tesla was able to use that to develop AC electricity, and all of them credit it to Shakespeare. So even though you would think that other people would have pointed this out before because it's written out in their own words, for some reason everyone seems to have avoided it.
Well, I think two things. One is that we all had, by the time we got there, we had Shakespeare sort of pounded into us, and there was we had no element of surprise.
Yeah.
We didn't go to a play, oh my goodness, this just happened. So there was none of the you got to be kidding, kind of thing. The other thing is that there are the people who say that Shakespeare wasn't just one person. It kind of screws everything up here, but that's okay. That's okay. We know it works. We know it works.
And to your point, I also didn't love Shakespeare when I was growing up. I really disliked Shakespeare. And so one of the things I wanted to do in this book is, if you've ever read Shakespeare and just thought, oh my goodness, I did not connect with Shakespeare at all, that was me. I read Shakespeare in high school and was like, oh my goodness, this is so tedious, And that was because of the way it was being taught to me. It was being taught to me that there was a right answer in the Shakespeare,
right,
that you needed to read it the right way. And this is, again, coming from this kind of computational model of how our school system works. Interpretation, which is what you're taught to do to literature, is actually a computer function. Computers are very good at interpreting. Interpreting is moving from one language to another. Computers are able to move in between, machine language and ASCII and all these other different languages. But when you're reading a story as a child, do you ever interpret it? No, right? You imagine yourself as the characters in the story. You say, what would I have done in that situation? And that is what we need to kind of get back into. If you give a Shakespeare play to an actor, you'll immediately see how it's supposed to be used. Because an actor will pick up the play and they'll start to imagine themselves as the character, and they'll start to say, what could I do that no other actor has ever done before in this role, but still have it work with the play? And the more that we bring that process into schools, the more I think that people are going to start to love Shakespeare again. Because that's what Shakespeare really is, not being told that, Macbeth is an allegory for this, that, or the other thing.
Yeah, allegory. Real
Yes.
bummer.
Yes.
Just a downer. Oh, yeah, let's do an allegory. Okay. Yeah. My final question here is in honor of our high scores in decision making.
Oh, yeah.
And for each of these areas, whether it's in the applied area or specific primal powers, there's lots of options for, hey, try this and try this. And this one just really got to me and said, pick a problem you're having. Ask friends for advice. Implement a piece of advice that makes you exactly as anxious as the problem does.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, this is right. Because, first of all, when we're really lost, right, we turn to someone for advice. And a lot of times what we're seeking in those moments is comfort, That's not what you want to do. You want to actually go with something that makes you as nervous, as trepidatious as the problem does, because that shows you that you're meeting the advice, you're meeting the moment. And so this is part of the process. Now, I always advise people to start trying this stuff on, not life and death things, Like if you're a surgeon in the ER, maybe that's not the time to try that out for the first time. But start to try these things. And what you'll start to realize is that it starts to activate these parts of your brain that had just been dormant. And the more you use them, the more powerful they'll become. And the more you realize that you just have this capacity inside yourself, which you haven't been using because the modern world has made you scared of yourself. It's made you scared of yourself, and you've internalized that. But the more you can start to lean into that power, the more you start to trust it, the more you start to trust yourself, the more you start to just experience this explosion of possibilities for your life.
But don't overuse your friends.
But don't overuse your friends.
just a little period at the end of that sentence there. Well, we have reached the end of this program. Thank you so much, Angus.
Thank you.
This is great. Angus Ledger.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Great. His new book is Primal Intelligence, You Are Smarter Than You Know. We encourage you to pick up a copy of the book here at your local bookstore, and Angus will be signing books out in the lobby after the program. For more information about membership or upcoming in-person and virtual Commonwealth Club events, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Moira Gunn. Thank you, and good evening.